My lords, the whole House will have been saddened by the news last week of the death of my noble friend, Lord Home of the Hirsel. I can think of no one who was held in greater respect or affection by this House, indeed by his party or by this nation at large. And your lordships, who were so often privileged to hear him speak, will wish to remember, I think, today his distinguished career, his charm, his wit, and his service to this place. Your lordships will already be familiar enough with the outlines of my noble friend's political life. I therefore perhaps do not need to rehearse them in some detail this afternoon. However, the length of his political experience, particularly of foreign affairs, has been equalled by few modern statesmen, and for me, indeed, it is something of a shock to realize that we are today paying tribute to a man who was already at the center of affairs by the time Hitler rose to power. Thus, when he came to occupy the great offices of Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, his natural courage and judgment were nourished by a length of perspective which is perhaps often the victim of the parliamentary hurly-burly of today. His achievements at the Scottish Office and the Commonwealth Relations Office have been justly and widely recognised. As Foreign Secretary, above all, he inspired trust, affection, and respect in equal measure. However, my lords, I suspect his achievements as Prime Minister and party leader have not perhaps received the notice that they deserve. After all, he inherited, and I make no comment about this, a demoralized and divided party, some of whose leading lights indeed refused to serve under him. And he faced a young and formidable leader of the opposition, who, encouraged by the howls of derision Lord Home attracted from much of the press, must have thought him easy prey. Yet, after only a year, he lost the election by a mere 4 seats. So his diffident manner was perhaps, after all, deceptive. Here, indeed, my lords, was a tough and tenacious politician, qualities, after all, which had always distinguished his border ancestors. My lords, it was that toughness, as well as his natural lack of rancour, that enabled him to continue in politics and to return in due course to the Foreign Office, where that very same quality enabled him famously to expel 105 Soviet spies from London. My lords, I have said that my noble friend was tough. His grasp of essentials was also rapid and striking to those who witnessed it. Indeed, his kindness in accepting invitations to address small audiences was legendary, and I was one of those fortunate in being a beneficiary of that kindness, particularly in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I remember well that arriving with a couple of minutes to spare, he would ask, "Now, what do you want me to say?" And I tried as best I could to explain the situation as I saw it, and must confess to your lordships today to wondering whether he was even listening to my briefing. Needless to say, I needn't have worried. His speech 2 minutes later not only showed that he'd listened to every word, but that he'd understood implications of events that his briefer had not yet even begun to spot. My lords, I was indeed fortunate to know Lord Home a little, and to have been the lucky recipient of his kindness and his hospitality. Anyone who saw him on his native heath would realize that Lanarkshire and the border country were as much a part of him as his rod and his gun. He belonged there, and he covered their accidented ground with effortless speed. However, my lords, I venture to suggest that he also belonged to your lordship's house. Indeed, he was the last Prime Minister to hold that office while a member of this place, albeit for only 4 days. And it's for this reason, of course, that his bust stands in the Norman porch to this day. My lords, his unassuming courtesy, his experience, his judgment, and his wit, because above all he was a very funny man, perhaps made him seem peculiarly at home in this place, and I venture to suggest, my lords, that we are grateful for the lustre that he added to our proceedings. My lords, I cannot finish without sending our best wishes and sympathy to his family. This, of course, is a conventional courtesy on occasions of this kind, and a very proper one. However, in my noble friend's case, the extraordinary happiness of his marriage and the affection in which he was so obviously held by his many relations make that convention particularly important to observe today. Lady Hume's death must have been a terrible blow to him, but it was one that he faced with his customary courage and indeed his customary modesty, and he faced with the love and the support of his children. My lords, I'm sure the whole House will recognize that this was a remarkable man and a great servant of the state. But he was also, my lords, which is rarer, a man who was much loved.
Yeah. Well done.
My lords, we on these benches are happy indeed to join with the Leader of the House in the sentiments he's just expressed. Lord Hume was for over 60 years a dedicated public servant of whom the party opposite and the country as a whole should be justly proud. Born into a noble and ancient border family, he determined to devote his life to politics. Educated at Eton, where he was no mean cricketer, and Christchurch, where he just failed to get a blue, he could have spent his time in much more aristocratic pursuits. That he did not, my lords, was very firmly his own decision. His father believed strongly, to use Lord Hume's own words, that it was a duty for one born with the means to be independent to undertake public service, but not apparently, he tells us, in politics. He read of this part of his life, "My father strongly advised me against politics as a career. He also told me that no Hume could drink champagne. Otherwise, a dutiful son, on both these points I disagreed and proved my point." First elected to Parliament in 1931, his career spanned some of the more turbulent years of this century. I always myself felt it was indicative of his nature and character that, having been Prime Minister, he nevertheless found it possible to serve as Foreign Secretary in the government of his successor as party leader. Reading the obituaries of Lord Hume, the two words which recur again and again are decency and integrity. While we on this side of the House did not, and indeed could not be expected to have agreed with all his views, there's no doubt that he held those views sincerely and that he advocated them honourably. Together with the late Earl of Stockton and others, some of whom are still in your Lordship's house, Lord Hume was one of those who put their distinctive stamp upon the Conservative Party, at least up until 1979. As The Guardian said of him, he was the embodiment of a moderate British Conservative tradition. It's that very moderation and decency for which we will remember him. He was invariably courteous and considerate, and party confrontation was hardly his style. Indeed, he became Prime Minister in 1963 precisely because of those qualities, which perhaps meant that he disunited the party less than any of his competitors, and they were qualities, my lords, which he displayed throughout his career. I think the intensity and the depth of the political battle today might have surprised and perhaps upset him. I was reading his autobiography again over the weekend, and I came across a few sentences which perhaps I may share with your lordships today, since they seem to me, at any rate, to encapsulate the nature of the man. He wrote this, he said, party leaders should exercise restraint in the use of the power of the majority to a point where it is not necessary for an opposition to pledge itself to undo what the government of the day has done. It's not an easy assignment, he said, but politics is a profession, not for the bully with a bludgeon, but for the artist with a baton. That seems to me, my lords, to sum up his whole approach to politics and public administration. Tough and shrewd, as the Leader of the House has said, he may have been, but honourable, decent, and a man of integrity he clearly was too. And for that, my lords, we mourn him.
My lords, Alec Hume, whose death we deeply regret, became Prime Minister almost accidentally, although, as is often the case with accidents, causing a few casualties in the process, and occupied the office briefly. If I try to think of a 19th century comparison, it would be with his fellow Scottish Earl, the somewhat elusive Lord Aberdeen, who was also a long-serving Foreign Secretary. But Aberdeen had a deeply melancholic private life, losing 2 wives and 5 children young, whereas Alec Hume, I hope and believe, had a full and happy old age, more so perhaps than any Prime Minister, except maybe for Attlee and Macmillan. He had an exceptionally long post-ministerial retirement, yet he was far from a shadow during these post-Downing Street years. He was Foreign Secretary for 3.5 of them. He was a frequent attender in your Lordship's house until fairly recently. I find it peculiarly easy to summon up a picture of that sparse figure and cranial yet benevolent head sitting somewhere between Lord Hailsham and Lord Boyd Carpenter. He never pushed himself forward. He had the most perfect good manners, based as high good manners mostly are, on a dual foundation of self-confidence and self-effacement. He was not an emotional orator, but he could make a speech of the occasion with a faultless touch and a delicate wit which I have never seen rivaled. He was, in some ways, I suppose, the final station on a railway line which may not survive the harsh commercialism of privatization. He was the last, thus far, of Eton's 18 prime ministers, and the last, thus far, of Christchurch's 30. But who knows, Fettes and St. John's College are thrusting in the wings. But whatever the future holds, we shall cherish the memory of Alec Hume, the more so perhaps if we do not, alas, see his like again.
My lords, for many years the crossbench peers have included several members who served under Lord Hume. I am one of them, and I hope I may be permitted to recall some of the experiences and impressions of him. Strangely enough, I have the clearest recollection of seeing, over 70 years ago, a picture of the Eton team in the Cricketer Weekly magazine. Seated in the centre was Lord Douglas wearing the captain's cap. I knew that our lives would never cross on the cricket field, but I did not imagine that I would ever work with that captain if he became Prime Minister or Foreign Secretary of our government at some distant date. It is of the period of 1970 to 1973 that I now want to briefly speak when I knew him best, and when I was his permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. The calm and friendly atmosphere of his Whitehall office was unique. His desk was usually clear of official papers, and within easy reach of his right hand was a copy of Ruff's Guide to the Turf. Often there was a welcome smile on his face as he came off the phone after advising his brother William where to place their money. If there was a morning meeting of officials, he usually put the first question of the day to the most junior officer in the room, who rose visibly in stature. Many of you who saw Lord Hume working in Whitehall know how encouraging he could be. There were no short tempers and no rebukes, even if justified. And those of us who were fortunate enough to travel with him abroad know what an inspiration he was and what an asset he could be to this country. His foreign opposite numbers, either friends or potential foes, clearly held him in great respect and often even affection, whether it was Gromyko or Zhou Enlai in China or Ian Smith in Rhodesia, to say nothing of American, European or Commonwealth leaders. Those of us who were with him could not but be proud of him. And may I quickly refer to two dramas in which he played a central role, one success and one setback. First, the expulsion from the country of the 105 Soviet intelligence agencies who have already been mentioned. And second, his attempt to solve the problem of Rhodesia. The mass expulsion of Soviet agents was opposed by certain fellow cabinet members who claimed that we would be the laughingstock of the world, and they were fearful of the extent of Russian reaction. But Lord Hume stuck to his guns and in the event was fully justified. Other friendly countries followed suit. Marshal Tito expelled one Soviet agent who had worked in London. Lord Hume sent the Marshal a telegram of congratulations saying, "Well done, keep them moving." His failure to settle the Rhodesian problem was a great disappointment to him. At one moment he thought he was being obstructed by some of those who claimed to be his friends. But the sincerity of the Secretary of State could be questioned neither by people at home nor by the suspicious Africans when he accepted at once the negative conclusions of the Pierce report, which had been delayed by events beyond the control of any of the parties. It was the most important action for the Commonwealth and for our international relations worldwide. Finally, his stamina at home and on exhaustive tours was remarkable. Abroad, it was characteristic that he didn't hesitate for a moment to eat and enjoy the most exotic Oriental food without the slightest damage, whilst others fell by the wayside. Alec Hume and Elizabeth, his wife, always acted as a team. From the angle of my life and my profession, I can think of no political pair who have made a more comparable contribution to the interests of this country. On his 70th birthday, we in the Foreign Office, with the assistance of Kew Gardens and Sir Anthony Ackland, gave him 91 trees and plants to mark the variety of the countries he had visited on his official duties. These are now planted in the grounds of the Hirsel, his family home, for all to see in the years to come.
My Lords, many years ago I was privileged to spend an evening with Lord and Lady Home at the home of one of my parishioners. I wish now that I could recall more of the conversation, but even after 25 years, the impression upon a young rector remains vivid, of a kind of wonder that this man of eminence should be such easy and delightful company. Before my hostess had a chance, he introduced himself, as if he expected I would have no idea who he was. That simple and humble courtesy was, of course, characteristic. I do remember regretting afterwards that I had not asked him more questions, because as those of your lordships who knew him will remember, he was a generous listener who had the endearing gift of making you feel that what you said was interesting and important, even if it wasn't. Much has been made by journalists of his privileged upbringing, but it was not that which marked the man. Rather, it was his total and unself-conscious dedication to the service of his fellow human beings. That sprang, of course, from long family tradition, but beneath was a profound faith in God, which was transparent, though never exhibited. Nor was his faith merely the inheritance of a Christian upbringing. He valued the habit of church-going and spoke more than once of the benefit of habit, closely allied to duty, that much derided virtue. But he made his own journey of faith, not evading hard questions, but through a combination of intellect and intuition, reaching not final answers, but certainly a faith by which to live. In the final chapter of his autobiography, after expressing gratitude to his family and especially to his beloved wife, he says, "Finally, I am glad that I was brought up in the Christian faith and provided with the hope of a God who is a Redeemer. I do not think I have been unduly influenced by the prospect, so to speak, of saving my own skin." He was, in matters of faith as in all things, modest, but he was also, in faith as in life, a man of total integrity. My Lords, no one can doubt, amongst those of us who share his faith and had the privilege of knowing him even slightly, that passing from this life, he earned that simplest and noblest of all accolades, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant."
Yeah. The Baroness Gardner of Parks.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.